Welcome, everyone, to a captivating exploration of folklore and legend. Today, we embark on a journey together. We will delve into a tale of mystery and intrigue. Without further ado, let's step into the shadows of this story.
Recap. The Winslow family navigates a night of revelations and growing tensions at Lady Fairchild's grand ball. Mrs. Winslow visits Mrs. Harrington for tea, and their cordial exchange hides a fierce rivalry. Mrs. Harrington hints at knowing Mr. Winslow's financial troubles, unsettling Mrs. Winslow, and teases her about Henry's failure to find a wife last season. The enigmatic Duke of Wiltshire's heir, Mr. Percy, returns to London, stirring rumours of scandalous affairs. Eliza, drawn to Mr. Percy, is torn between duty and desire. At the ball, Eliza is rescued from a tense conversation with Mrs. Harrington by Mr. James Thornton, who issues a veiled warning to Mrs. Harrington. Meanwhile, Henry is distracted by both his father's heated conversation with Mrs. Harrington and his growing interest in Amelia Harrington. Eliza catches the Duke's attention, leading to an intense interaction that leaves her flattered and confused. The Winslow family returns home with more questions than answers, setting the stage for further intrigue. Episode 4. Morning Revelations. Elizas Bedroom. The morning sun filtered softly through the lace curtains of Eliza's bedroom, casting a gentle glow on the elegant furnishings. Eliza sat at her vanity, brushing her hair, the events of the previous night still fresh in her mind. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the door bursting open.
Good morning, Eliza.
Mary, Eliza's younger sister, entered the room with a burst of energy.
I've been dying to hear about last night's ball.
Eliza turned to her sister with a warm smile, grateful for the distraction.
Good morning, Mary. You're up early.
Mary flopped onto Eliza's bed, her eyes wide with excitement.
I couldn't sleep. Tell me everything. How many men did you dance with? Did anyone catch your eye?
Eliza chuckled softly.
You're always so eager for details, Mary. I danced with several gentlemen, but there's no need to get too excited.
Mary leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with curiosity.
And what about the Duke? Is he as handsome as the rumours say? What was it like dancing with him?
Eliza's smile faltered slightly, remembering how she hadn't actually danced with the Duke, despite her hopes. She decided to focus on the parts of the evening that Mary would enjoy hearing about.
The Duke was indeed very charming. His presence certainly commanded attention.
Mary sighed dreamily.
Oh, Eliza, I wish I could have been there to see it all. What was he like up close? Was he as dashing as they say?
Eliza nodded, her thoughts momentarily drifting to the Duke's enigmatic presence.
He has a certain charisma. It's easy to see why he's the talk of the season.
Mary's excitement was palpable.
And Mr. Thornton? He's always so mysterious. Did you dance with him too?
Eliza hesitated, recalling the tension-filled dance with Mr. Thornton and his subsequent scolding.
Yes, I did. Mr. Thornton is quite the character.
Mary's eyes widened.
What do you mean?
Eliza shook her head with a smile.
It's nothing, Mary. He was just as polite and gentlemanly as ever. Now, enough about me. How was your evening?
Mary pouted slightly, clearly wanting more details, but she obliged.
It was rather uneventful compared to yours, I'm sure, but you won't believe what happened with Evelyn.
Eliza raised an eyebrow, intrigued.
Oh, do tell.
Mary grinned, sitting up straighter.
Well, Evelyn was helping one of the new servants, Thomas, in the kitchen. Apparently Thomas isn't very good with the fine china yet. He managed to drop a whole stack of plates right in front of Cook.
Eliza couldn't help but laugh.
Poor Thomas. What did Cook do?
Mary giggled.
Cook was so furious she started yelling and Thomas turned as red as a beet. But then, just as Cook was about to really let him have it, Evelyn stepped in and started singing this silly song about being careful. It was so absurd that even Cook couldn't keep a straight face.
Eliza laughed harder, imagining the scene.
Evelyn always knows how to lighten the mood.
Mary nodded enthusiastically.
Exactly. By the end of it, everyone was laughing, and Cook even gave Thomas some tips on how to handle the china better. It was such a relief to see something funny after such a serious week. But it was rather uneventful compared to yours. but I can't wait for my turn to attend such grand balls.
Eliza laughed, reaching out to squeeze her sister's hand.
Your time will come, Mary, and when it does, you'll be the belle of the ball. I'm certain of it.
The sisters shared a moment of light-hearted laughter. The weight of the previous night's events temporarily lifted. Just then, the headmaid, Mrs. Thompson, entered the room, her expression a mix of relief and mild annoyance.
There you are, Miss Mary. I've been looking all over the house for you. It's time to get dressed for breakfast.
Mary sighed, standing up reluctantly.
Yes, Mrs. Thompson, I was just catching up with Eliza.
Mrs. Thompson gave a small smile.
I understand, but you mustn't keep everyone waiting. Breakfast is nearly ready.
Mary turned to Eliza with a playful wink.
We'll continue our conversation later.
Eliza smiled warmly.
I'll look forward to it.
The dining room. Later in the morning, the Winslow family gathered in the dining room for breakfast. The atmosphere was noticeably tense, a stark contrast to Mary's earlier enthusiasm. Mr. Winslow sat silently, his face a mask of worry, while Mrs. Winslow attempted to maintain a semblance of normalcy. Henry, who had been observing his father closely, exchanged a concerned glance with Eliza. She knew he was just as worried about their father's confrontation with Mrs. Harrington as she was, but neither of them dared to bring it up in front of their parents. Mrs. Winslow cleared her throat, breaking the silence.
Eliza, dear, did you enjoy the ball last night?
Eliza nodded, offering a small smile.
Yes, Mother. It was a lovely evening.
Mary, still buzzing with excitement, chimed in.
Eliza told me all about it this morning. She danced with so many gentlemen and even spoke with the Duke.
I never.
She stopped herself and reconsidered correcting Mary. Even though she had never really told Mary that she had spoken to the Duke, she had been intentionally vague about him in their conversation that morning. But what good could come from saying anything now, when Mrs. Winslow looked so pleased? Mrs. Winslow's eyes sparkled with pride.
That's wonderful to hear, Eliza. I'm glad you had a good time.
As the conversation continued, Eliza's thoughts drifted back to the previous night's events. The tension with Mr. Thornton, the heated exchange between her father and Mrs. Harrington, and the Duke's enigmatic presence and how he spent most of the night with Amelia Harrington all swirled in her mind. The Winslow family had finished their breakfast, but the tension lingered. Mrs. Winslow, determined to get to the bottom of the situation with Mrs. Harrington, decided to pay her a visit. She donned her bonnet and cloak, steeling herself for the confrontation ahead. As she arrived at the Harrington residence, she knocked on the door, her heart pounding with anticipation. To her surprise, the door was opened by none other than the Duke of Wiltshire. The Duke.
Good morning, Mrs. Winslow.
Good morning, Your Grace. I wasn't expecting to see you here.
Nor I you, Mrs. Winslow. I was just leaving. I trust you are well?
As well as can be expected. Might I have the pleasure of your company sometime soon for dinner?
I would be delighted to join your family dinner. I shall write to you and inform you of my availability.
It would be an honour to have you join us. I look forward to your letter. I hope you have a pleasant day, Your Grace.
And you as well, Mrs. Winslow?
With a courteous nod, the Duke departed, leaving Mrs. Winslow with even more questions. She was shown into the drawing room by the head servant, her mind racing with possibilities. The Harrington drawing room. Mrs. Harrington entered the drawing room, her expression one of polite surprise.
Mrs. Winslow, what an unexpected pleasure. To what do I owe the honour of this unannounced visit?
Mrs. Winslow, maintaining her composure, replied,
Good morning, Mrs. Harrington. I hope I am not intruding, but I felt it necessary to speak with you.
Mrs. Harrington's eyes glinted with a mix of curiosity and amusement.
Of course, dear. Please have a seat. I must say it is rather rare to have such impromptu visits.
Mrs. Winslow took a seat, her back straight and her expression resolute.
I wanted to discuss the matter between you and my husband.
Mrs. Harrington raised an eyebrow, her smile never wavering.
Oh, and what matter might that be?
Mrs. Winslow's frustration grew, but she kept her voice steady.
The conversation you had with him last night at the ball, it seemed rather heated.
Mrs. Harrington tilted her head slightly, her tone dripping with feigned innocence.
Heated, you say? I recall no such thing. Perhaps you misunderstood the situation.
Mrs. Winslow's patience was wearing thin.
I find that hard to believe, Mrs. Harrington. My husband was clearly distressed.
Mrs. Harrington's smile widened, a hint of condescension in her eyes.
Men often worry about things that we women have no control over. Perhaps it was simply a misunderstanding.
Seeing that she would get no straight answers, Mrs. Winslow decided to change her approach.
Very well, Mrs. Harrington. I shall not press the matter further, but I do hope that whatever the issue is, it can be resolved without further distress to my family.
Mrs. Harrington nodded gracefully.
Of course, Mrs. Winslow. I assure you, I wish nothing but the best for your family. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have some pressing matters to attend to.
Mrs. Winslow stood, her frustration barely contained.
Thank you for your time, Mrs. Harrington.
The Winslow home. Mrs. Winslow returned home, her mind still reeling from the cryptic conversation. She found Eliza in the sitting room, engrossed in a book. Eliza looked up, sensing her mother's unease.
Mother, is everything all right?
Mrs. Winslow forced a smile.
Yes, dear, everything is fine. I just had a rather unproductive conversation with Mrs. Harrington.
Eliza frowned.
Did she say anything about father?
Mrs. Winslow shook her head.
No, nothing of substance, but I fear there is more to this than we know.
Eliza nodded, her concern mirrored in her eyes.
We will find out, Mother. Together. Mother, may I go to Willow Glen Park for a stroll? I think some fresh air would do me good.
Mrs. Winslow.
Of course, dear, but you must have a chaperone. Henry, would you accompany your sister?
Henry, who had been brooding nearby, looked up and nodded.
Yes, Mother. I'll be happy to chaperone Eliza.
Willow Glen Park. Willow Glen Park was a picturesque escape, with sprawling lawns, blooming flowers, and a gentle breeze rustling through the trees. Eliza and Henry walked along the path, enjoying the serene beauty of the park. Henry maintained a respectful distance behind Eliza, his attention caught by Miss Arabella Weston, the young lady from the ball. As they walked, Eliza spotted her friend, Miss Lydia Fairfax, sitting on a bench. Lydia waved enthusiastically, and Eliza quickened her pace to join her. Lydia.
Eliza, it's so wonderful to see you. How was the ball last night?
Eliza, smiling.
It was quite the event. There were so many people and so much to see.
Lydia, laughing.
And how many young men did you dance with? Any handsome suitors catch your eye?
Eliza, laughing.
A few, perhaps, but it was all very overwhelming.
As the friends chatted and laughed about the young men they found interesting, Henry walked a few paces behind, deep in conversation with Miss Weston. Their interaction was animated, and it was clear they enjoyed each other's company. The Duke.
Good afternoon, Miss Winslow. May I join you for a moment?
Eliza's heart skipped a beat, but she maintained her composure, turning abruptly, her cheeks flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration.
Good afternoon, Your Grace. Of course.
As they walked a short distance away from Lydia and Sir Waterbolt, a gentleman who was walking with the Duke, Eliza's mind raced with a mixture of excitement and irritation. She had hoped for a dance with the Duke last night, but he had never asked.
I trust you enjoyed the ball last night?
Eliza, slightly elusive.
It was a lovely evening, Your Grace, though I must admit I am rather surprised to see you today.
The Duke looked taken aback, his eyes softening.
Why is it a surprise?
Eliza hesitated, then decided to speak.
Might I speak plainly, for it is not in my nature to dance around matters?
The Duke, with a look of wonder.
Yes, please.
Last night, at the ball, you did not ask me to dance, but you spent the evening following me with your eyes while another held your interest. Was it my demeanour, or something else that caused you to disregard me?
The Duke took a deep breath and stepped closer.
Miss Winslow, I fear you misread me. If another held my interest, my eyes would not have been on you.
Eliza stepped back. The Duke was so close she could taste his essence. She softened her demeanour slightly, but maintained her resolve.
Do you think I desire to be a mere afterthought? I am no one's afterthought, Your Grace, least of all yours.
Eliza saw the confusion on the Duke's face but could not restrain herself. Perhaps she was more distressed than she realised that he had spent the night dancing and laughing with Amelia Harrington. The Duke frowned, looking troubled, his expression intense.
Miss Winslow, that was never my intention, I assure you. But do I see a hint of jealousy in your eyes?
He teased her with laughter. Eliza felt flustered, blinking twice as fast to conceal her eyes.
I beg your pardon. See it as you wish, Your Grace, but please note, I am not one of those young ladies you view as a rare thing to be collected and conquered.
Eliza's hint at the rumours about the Duke was clear. Many believed that the Duke used his considerable charm and good looks to manipulate young ladies into falling for him, only to discard them when they no longer served his interests. It was whispered that during his travels abroad, the Duke engaged in several scandalous affairs with women of high and low status alike, leaving a trail of broken hearts and tarnished reputations. The Duke stepped closer, his eyes locking onto hers.
I do hope, Miss Winslow, that when you find me at the aisle waiting for you to walk to me, your impression of me will have changed by then.
Eliza's breath caught in her throat.
Your Grace, I...
Before Eliza could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of Amelia Harrington, who had been watching the intense exchange from a distance. Sensing the tension, she decided to intervene. Amelia.
Good afternoon, Eliza. Your Grace, I hope I am not interrupting.
The Duke stepped back from Eliza and bowed to Amelia. Eliza glanced at Amelia, then back at the Duke.
I was just taking my leave,
she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Henry, noticing the interaction, quickly approached.
Eliza, it's time we headed back.
He offered her his arm, his eyes briefly meeting Amelia's. There was a flicker of emotion there, a mixture of jealousy and longing. As they walked away, Henry glanced at Eliza, concern evident in his eyes.
What was all that about, Eliza? You seemed quite upset.
Eliza sighed, her mind still reeling from the conversation.
The Duke. He was apologising for not asking me to dance last night. But it felt more complicated than that.
Henry frowned.
Complicated how?
Eliza hesitated.
He claimed he was interested in me, that he spent the night watching me. But I can't shake the feeling that he's hiding something. And then Amelia arrived and it just felt intense.
Eliza omitted most of the conversation because she dare not tell him the truth about the Duke's forwardness towards her. Henry nodded thoughtfully.
The Duke has a reputation, Eliza. You need to be careful.
Eliza looked up at her brother, her eyes filled with determination.
I know, Henry. I won't let him play with my feelings.
Henry squeezed her arm reassuringly.
Good. And speaking of being careful, what did Mother say about her visit to Mrs. Harrington?
Eliza's expression darkened.
She didn't get any answers. Mrs. Harrington was evasive as usual.
Henry sighed.
Father looked so troubled this morning. I wish we knew what was going on.
Eliza nodded.
We'll figure it out, Henry. We have to.
As they continued their walk, both siblings were lost in their thoughts, the weight of their family's secrets and the Duke's confession heavy on their minds. They couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to change in ways they could not yet comprehend. The Winslow home! The family returned home, each lost in their own thoughts about the day's events. Eliza felt a mix of excitement and trepidation about her growing interest in the Duke. Henry, while pleased with his own budding friendship with Miss Weston, was still wary of the Duke's intentions toward his sister. As they gathered for dinner, the atmosphere was lighter, the day's fresh air and social interactions having lifted their spirits, if only temporarily. But the underlying tension from the ball and Mrs. Winslow's visit to Mrs. Harrington remained, casting a shadow over the evening. Mr. Winslow.
Eliza, how was your stroll in the park?
Eliza, smiling.
It was refreshing, Father. I met with Lydia and had a pleasant conversation with the Duke.
Mrs. Winslow's eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing, her thoughts clearly preoccupied. Just then there was a knock at the door. What will be the consequences of Mrs. Harrington's blackmail? Mr. Winslow is clearly troubled by the threat. How will this affect the Winslow family's standing and Eliza's prospects? How will Eliza navigate her feelings for the Duke and Mr. Thornton? Eliza's interactions with both men have left her with mixed emotions. How will she balance her ambitions with her personal feelings? What are Henry's true feelings for Amelia? Henry's jealousy hints at deeper emotions. How will his feelings for Amelia influence his actions moving forward? Dive into the captivating world of Whisper of Oakwood Lane and uncover the secrets of the Winslow family. Join Eliza, Henry and their friends as they navigate the treacherous waters of 18th century London high society. Will Eliza find true love or become ensnared in scandal? Can the Winslow family maintain their standing amidst blackmail and deception? Don't miss out on the drama, romance and intrigue. Subscribe now to stay updated with the latest episodes and follow the unfolding story of the Winslow family and their rivals. Hit the like button, share with your friends and let us know in the comments who your favourite character is and what you think will happen next. Stay tuned for more thrilling episodes filled with mystery and passion.